started. So Megan and Pat, I'll leave it to you.
Okay, great. So go ahead. Thanks for coming today, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Pat Green. I've been with SCM Connections for about 8 or 9 years, we've got Megan with us today. And I've been through several demand planning activities, sales and operations planning, et cetera. So I've been doing this for about 20 years or so. Work on demand processing, demand management, statistical forecasting, et cetera. It's kind of my area of expertise. And then Megan, if you want to give a quick overview of yourself.
Yeah, so I have about 8 years of experience in the supply chain area, multiple different areas, but demand, procurement, supply, inventory management. Mainly my experience lies in manufacturing and chemical distribution and also the CPG industry. So, and my focus has been demand management recently. So.
Okay. Great. Next slide. Go ahead. Mike, I'll let you kind of give the overview.
Yeah, sure. So thanks everybody again for coming. This is a webinar, one in the series of many that we ended up doing to help the entire supply chain community really out of this crisis, and I don't know what else you could call it but a crisis. And it's kind of an area we feel like was really needed. SCM Connections is a bit of a unique firm in that we are supply chain first. We've been working with SAP products, the partners anyway, for about 20-ish years. As a company, we're, how old, Pat? 7 years old now? It's 8 years, something like that. And we really tried to focus on helping our clients understand the supply chain impacts of systems, not just how to implement. And it's been received fairly well, as I think a lot of our clients would tell you. So today we're going to look at that and help kind of share our experience and answer a lot of questions. I know there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And we're going to give our perspective on sort of two areas in this webinar. One is how do you manage in a crisis like this, and how far can tools practically take you? And then at what point do you have to have people kind of jump in and take over? So should be a good one. We had a lot of great response, and this will be followed up actually next week as well with a sister webinar, which is going to be the supply side of it. So today is going to be the demand side. How do you manage a demand signal in chaos? And the next Thursday, same time, will be another webinar on the supply side. So be sure to register for that. You'll get a link afterwards in your email, and it'll also be in at the end of the deck.
Okay, Megan, want to scroll down one? Okay. So we're going to talk today really what IBP provides, and some of the kind of core building blocks of demand management, tactical and operational demand management. And really, you kind of have your consensus demand planning process is kind of sitting on top of that. That's really kind of describing how to come up with a consensus demand plan that you're going to drive your supply network with, right? It's really about collaboration, coming up with, getting all the stakeholders involved to come up with one plan, one number that we're going to drive and that you're going to use for all of your supply planning, right? Kind of encapsulated within the demand management process. And then there's also statistical forecasting and demand sensing components of the solution within IBP. Statistical forecasting is really all the math behind the numbers to come up with a statistically accurate or feasible number that'll help you drive your forecast. And then demand sensing is that short-term reacting very quickly to short-term demand signals that are coming out of your supply chain, whether those are orders, point of sale, data, exogenous factors, et cetera, that help you now maximize your customer service and maximize customer demand in that very short period. All of that kind of comes together within the IBP demand module. Okay.
And Pat, one thing I just want to highlight here is all these elements combined are really required to manage a scenario like this. You can't rely on really any of them, right? And that's really where demand management comes to the forefront as a concept, more than just a system functionality, which all those you could break down into system deliverables, demand management really becomes the process itself, and that's really the only thing that's going to lead you out of a scenario like this.
Yeah, and that's kind of as we get into our demo a little bit later in the webinar, we'll talk through some of the tools, demand sensing and statistical forecasting are part of the components, but in cases like, you know, the COVID-19 and the crisis we're in right now, that's probably not good enough. So you need some, you know, it really kind of the people take over, and then you need a tool that can accurately and quickly manage multiple scenarios, and that's really where IBP shines. Okay, so you can move on, Megan, to the next. Okay, and then, you know, if you kind of think about supply chain challenges you have today, so this is kind of an overview of, you know, we've got volatile demand, you know, the customer experiences you're struggling with, heightened expectations for responsiveness, right? Being able to supply to your customer at their customer whims, and obviously more complex supply chains with global reach. And we're seeing a lot of the implications of that and some of the limitations when you have a crisis the size of the COVID, a global crisis, where these complex supply chains become infinitely more complex when you're trying to source materials across the world. Now, you've got some systems issues, right? Companies face with disconnected data sources and processes, people working in disparate systems, et cetera, and really ad hoc collaboration, right? So you're working on something on your desk rather than working on it in a system that everyone can see, okay? But innovative technologies like IBP can provide virtual vital business information across, you know, the networked economy. Improve real-time data analysis is really kind of one of the key things, is being able to get the data on a regular basis, on an up-to-date basis, and actually use that quickly and efficiently, so you're not searching for the next answer, which is 3 weeks down the road. You'll be able to see it today and get to that answer quickly. And finally, better collaboration within departments within your organization. That's not only internally, but externally expanding your supply chain into your networks, both customers and vendors, to be able to adequately and quickly respond to customer demands, changes, you know, and their expectations, as well as the opportunities in front of you. Okay, so go ahead, Megan. Okay, so we had this in our last webinar a couple of weeks ago. We said it was what a week, but we have to say what a month. This has been crazy. It's been unprecedented. You know, the COVID experience for many companies has just turned their supply chains upside down. You've got, you know, in some industries, you've got a demand without the ability to get to the right product to your customer, i.e. if you're looking at the dairy industry and food and milk, you have, you know, milk dumping in some industries because they can't get the product, they're not staffed up, and they don't have the adequate supply chain capability to get product from student demand to the end user demand, which is in the supermarkets. You've got other industries where everything is just completely dried up, you know, the fashion industry, et cetera, where the stores are just closed. So now how do you manage outside of that? And there's a lot of risk and a lot of, we'll call them, you know, black swan events where we don't know how to come out of this. And really there's a lot of risk to your business of navigating these waters effectively. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Mike or Megan, but it's kind of a crazy time right now.
You know, and I say that it's not just what a month, but these things seem to be happening. I mean, it could just be sensitivity to it, but with more frequency, right? Whether it's a tariff situation, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's, you know, international trade disputes. So while this is definitely one of the largest ones that I think I've ever experienced, you have these mini ones pop up all the time. Everything from a social media stampede to a natural disaster really have the same impact on your supply chain.
Right, right. This one just happens to be pervasive and across the globe and global in nature rather than specific to your supply chain. So yeah, these are things that are, you know, navigating through it and getting through it with the right system in place is going to be key. Okay, you want to slide down, Megan? Okay, so what does that mean? So uncertainty, I mean, if you look at the world in front of us, it's uncertainty, right? So it requires flexibility not only within your systems, but within the processes you put in place, right? So, you know, one of the key things that IBP brings to the table is scenario planning. So you can quickly look at various scenarios and look at the and review with some accuracy and with some real numbers quickly various scenarios that impact your demand plan and how that impacts your supply plan, your ability to react to changes within demand and as well as changes within supply. Okay, so that's kind of the teaser for next week, but kind of keep that in mind as we go through the demand side. You need to make informed decisions based on data, not just what you're seeing or not on gut, right? So if we have these things today, we'll talk a little bit more on gut because some things are unexpected, but your kind of common core business, there are things that happen all the time that really should be data driven, okay? You need things like market trends, what the point of sale, all of those things that kind of come into, like Mike was talking, you know, a social media stampede, you have, you know, tariffs, et cetera, that kind of shift your demand stream, your demand signal over time that you need to react to quickly. And really, it lays the foundation for the S&OP process, relying on your sales, marketing, consensus, financial plans, et cetera, bringing those together to agree upon what the appropriate demand plan is going forward for your business. So it's not in a vacuum, and this is how we're going to plan. You will always have those short-term adjustments you'll need to make, but really you're trying to get agreement along the organization and with the executives to come up with a plan that makes sense for your business that you can execute to. Okay, next slide. So how do we how do we handle the demand signal going forward, right? So, I mean, obviously today's a little bit different because we're talking COVID, but really we kind of look at various things. What does the math say? What are the statistical forecasts? How do those come into play? What does that look like? You know, if I look at my sales history, that's one data point, but how does that project my sales going forward, right? What are my previous sales? What are my supply chain constraints or my ability to supply? How are the outliers considered? And how does my consensus demand affect me, you know, me and my business going forward, right? So I've got to manage that whole process so I can get a demand signal to maximize my customer service with minimizing my inventory levels. And again, it's kind of the first stop and it's the key input into creating an effective supply plan. Okay, scroll down. Next slide. Okay, nope. Yep. Up. Yeah, so the next one is one more down. Okay. So managing uncertainty requires flexibility. And today we're going to talk about our scenario. As we look at the scenario today that we're going to go through is so we're going to talk through how the coronavirus is impacting a specific line and how did we get here, right? So taking a look at the different scenarios that are available, and then how do we actually utilize those within our supply plan. Okay. So with that being said, Megan,
you want to start with the baseline view?
Yeah, so what
the S&OP review?
Yeah, exactly. So I want to start with the baseline view.
You can still see my screen, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So when we kind of talk through the scenario we're going to go through today, we're going to, the product that we're going to look at is going to be, we're going to be looking at pink shirts, or we're going to model an apparel line that's seen its demand kind of fall through the floor. And so their demand will completely evaporate it. And we need to really come out of that, as we come out of that, how we're going to manage that effectively going forward. So if I look here, what I'm showing today is my baseline plan, which is, if we're going out today from April, this point going forward, this would have been created, say, 2 months ago or a month ago, right? And this is a plan that I would have for the rest of the year. So if I look at my sales plan, I can see that my my baseline plan is, steady across the top there. My statistical forecasts and my consensus quantities are there. My sales forecasts are kind of all about the same. So this is my plan as of last month. I know that currently, if I execute to this plan, it's not going to, I'm going to way over forecast based on the recent event. So I need to, the scenario is we need to come up with a better plan based on the math, based on my consensus demand planning process, as well as bringing the right stakeholders to the table to come up with a consensus plan that we can then use for a supply. Okay. So go ahead, Megan, if you want to kind of take the next thing.
Okay.
Okay.
So the next thing that we're going to kind of talk through is the actual math behind your statistical forecasting, your pre-processing steps, which we're going to talk about outlier correction and the evaporation of sales and what IBP can do to actually handle those. And so if everyone can see my screen, I'm going to actually start out in the web UI. So there's two UIs for IBP. You can utilize Excel, which is connected to your database, connected to your IBP database. And then you also have the Fiori, this launch pad here, kind of like multiple different apps. This app is called Managed Forecast Model, but there's multiple different apps for supply, demand, all of the different facets that IBP actually, all of the modules that are in IBP. So what I'm going to do here is just show you briefly this forecasting model, and we're going to start with the basic time settings. So time setting for this is going to be week. There are multiple different time settings, but we're going to keep it simple as a week. And what this historical periods is telling you is that I'm going to look back 52 weeks into my sales history, and that's how I'm going to get my forecast going forward. And IBP is saying, okay, I'm going to forecast out for you for 52 weeks. And we don't have any of the other settings. Consider product lifecycle management, new product introduction, those kinds of things. But the important thing that we want to focus on are these pre-processing steps. So outlier correction in IBP is a really powerful tool where IBP will go in and it will look at your sales history, and it's going to cleanse your sales history based on these detection and correction methods that you have set. So for our POC today, we have our outlier detection method is going to be the variance test. And basically what that's going to do is check the time series values, and it's going to see if it deviates from the mean more than a standard deviation multiplied by the constant, which here we have the constant, right? And the outlier correction method that we're going to utilize is the correction with mean. And there are multiple different correction methods. Maybe you don't want a correction and you want to just know for future looking periods that you want to see that you did have an outlier in this time period. But for our POC, we're going to use the correction with mean. So what that is IBP is going to say if something in your sales history lies outside of your upper and your lower limit, it's going to correct it, and it's going to correct it with the mean. And the input for this algorithm is going to be actual quantity adjusted, and then the result is actually going to be saved in final actuals cleansed. And I'll show you what this looks like in the actual data model in Excel also. And the other pre-processing step that we talked about is substitute missing values. So when you have evaporation of sales. And in the substitute missing values, basically, there are different methods for substitution. There are similarly, you can do it with your median. You can also use a given value and the time of scope. So your full horizon, your future, or just your history. And then the input, we're going to use the same input, actuals quantity adjusted, and we're going to use the final actuals cleansed as the same output for this. And so this takes you into your next step, which is your forecast, your actual statistical forecast calculated in IBP. And so what this is a statistical best fit. And it's going to take all of these different forecasting methods there are multiple that we don't have included in this, 20-ish, I think. And it's going to say which is the best fit. It's going to choose your best forecast going forward. And briefly, in the post-processing steps, this is where you're going to find all of your error measures. Any MAPE, MAD, root, any of the roots, the mean square error that you're looking for. This is where you're going to find any of those error measurements that you're looking for.
Right.
And also, I actually just created a 5-minute video on outlier correction. So if you want to know any more about setting it up, you can go on YouTube for SCM Connections, and you'll be able to find a little bit more information about how to actually set up the outlier. Sorry, Pat.
No, and I was just going to say, and what we're trying to do here is let the math and kind of statistics behind the scenes determine whether or not we've got an outlier or we've got an anomaly within our data. We put up parameters around it, the guardrails, and what this allows us to do is, you know, this environment's a little bit unusual, but in general, if you have an anomaly within, you know, a big promotion or something that causes a spike or a decrease in your demand, in 1 or 2 periods, outlier correction would bring that back to the mean. So you've got the data that, you know, over time you can create your trend or your better statistical statistical forecast, as opposed to introducing an anomaly that's outside the variance into your forecast, which then can skew your results. Okay?
So just one question, Pat. How would you go about setting those variants? Is that something more from experience, or is in your mind, or is that something that you would go case by case?
Yeah, it's a little bit more case by case. You know, you can, if your bands are a little too tight, you're going to have a lot more. Everything's going to kind of revert to the mean. And then more if it's too wide, then you're not getting any of the variability, or sorry, any of the outliers. You're not correcting those to the mean. So there's kind of a balance that you do over time as part of a tuning process. There's in every demand stream is a little bit different. So there's not necessarily a one size fits all, but you want to just kind of take a good chance of getting the 80-20 rule to get most of this kind of knocked out if you can. Okay, go ahead, Megan.
Okay, great. So what we're going to focus on here is our mean. This is going to be the mean of the last 52 weeks of your sales history. So that's going to be your average. So that's one thing that we're going to focus on, the standard deviation of your sales history. So this is going to help to set that upper and lower limit that we talked about. And here is the mean plus D times standard deviation of actual quantity. Basically, all that means is this is going to be the upper limit. So I'm going to add that to my series here. I want to be able to see that in my graph. And this is going to be my lower limit. And these are going to be my actuals adjusted. This is going to be my sales history. So with that being said, I want to filter based on these parameters, and I want to also change my chart type to where you can see the upper and lower limits as lines. So we can visually see when an outlier happens. So as you can see here, here's our actuals, and also you can view it up here as a little bit easier to read. You're going to look through and you're going to say, okay, all of my actuals are within the limits that I've set. And you're going to see here in week 6 that we have outliers. And as you can see in this graph also as a different depiction, you can see that we're at 11,500. That's outside of our standard. That's outside of where our limits that we set. And so IBP is going to say, okay, we need to replace that that sales history with the mean. And so that's exactly what IBP is doing here. Anytime that even upper or lower limit, if it's outside of the limit, it's going to basically say, all right, we need to make a cleansed history, and we need to, you know, fix basically your sales history. And the next thing that I'm going to look through is the evaporation of sales. So how does IBP handle things like, similarly, how does IBP handle something here where you have a constant steady demand and then you have a zero? This could happen for multiple different reasons, but IBP doesn't care about the reason. What it cares about is cleansing your history with your mean. And so now when you forecast going forward, this should help. But what we're seeing right now during coronavirus is the evaporation of sales and the outlier correction are so many that it's making your standard deviation and your upper and your lower limits so large that now everything is not an outlier anymore, or the opposite effect, everything is an outlier. And so your statistical forecast going forward is not good enough.
And that's actually one of the questions that we just had here in the chat was, what happens if the outliers become the new normal? Which I think you've addressed there, and that's something you need to look for. The other question we got is the outlier correction available within S&OP or just demand? And the answer is demand.
Demand, yep. Yeah, it's a good question. You know, and this is where you're going to have a lot of this next 3 to 6 to 12 months are going to be, you know, demand planners are going to have a very difficult job trying to figure out what are true outliers and what are, you know, how does this demand kind of bounce back? And does it bounce back, and what's the timeline to do it? I think the math, right? When I say the math, I mean the statistical forecasting and using, you know, the algorithm to figure that out is going to be, it's going to be very unpredictable and, you know, unreliable, I would say, just because you're going to have, it's going to be a very unusual period going forward, and there's going to have to be some adjustments made manually. I think the demand manager statistical forecaster role is going to be much more of a demand manager role, working with the S&OP plan to come up with a consensus forecast that everyone can buy off on. Just because at this point, a lot of these numbers, and especially as you start going 3, 4, 5 months down the road, where your demand is skewed from where it was before, you're going to get results that are unreliable. Okay. And so that that kind of teases up with, and Megan, I think you have a view here where we can see where the statistical forecast kind of lays over the sales history. Is that correct?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Right. So if you kind of look here, you know, you're looking at a statistical forecast quantity, and then you kind of look at your history over time. These are your actuals, and this would have been your statistical forecast. If you follow the trend, it's going to continue going up over time. It won't kind of back down. So with that being said, I mean, this is kind of the numbers you're going to have to make some adjustments, because if you don't make those adjustments, so if you go out a little bit forward, and this is on a weekly basis within this particular graph, your statistical forecast will look like this going forward, right? And that's probably not where you're going to want to be at the end of the year, because if you make to that plan, you're probably going to, number one, you may not be able to get the materials, and number two, you're going to be sitting with a lot of inventory in your warehouses that you're not going to be able to move. So with that being said, I think that kind of tees up the next part of this, which is the demand management process, right? So if you go back to the slides, Megan. Okay. So if you kind of look at, you know, one of the things, yeah, go ahead.
There you go.
Yeah, go ahead. Go down to the slide we were looking at the scenarios. Keep going
Yep.
down. All right. So if you look at this, what we're going to try and model here is really what do we think, and this all comes back to getting the right stakeholders to the table to start driving a forecast that we think would be likely or could be likely based on the scenarios we know today. And then using that to determine your financial plan, your demand plan, as well as then use that to bang up against your supply plan to see if you can actually execute to this plan. But if you kind of, the scenarios we're going to look through today would be, you know, 3 different scenarios that we're going to implement, or we're going to show in IBP, which would be number one, a bounce back recovery, right? Do we think this is going to be V-shaped? Do we think we'll be able, in certain products, this will exactly be the case, that our demand signal, our demand will return to normal very quickly. So you'll have products within your portfolio that this is what's going to happen. And then, you want to be able to see that and plan for that if you think that that's the likely scenario. Again, you'll have some that'll be more along the lines of what we consider a midterm recovery, right? The demand gap will, our demand will just drop off a cliff. We'll slowly have some sales, and then over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, we'll recover to a point where we were prior to the COVID epidemic. And then finally, we have some, and probably a likely scenario for a lot of folks is going to be the long-term demand loss. And that's really where we're saying, okay, well, this is another scenario where we think that the demand is going to just kind of taper off, and we don't know that we'll ever get it back. Now, the flip side of this is also potentially true, right? You may have materials that you're going to see, or products that you're going to have a very short-term spike, right? If you're selling surgical masks, you probably are scrambling to get things, to keep up with demand. You certainly, a lot of food and beverage, as you're looking at the grocery stores and consumer products, people were stockpiling up and you've depleted all of your inventories. Well, now you've got to kind of have the opposite effect. You have, does it cannibalize future sales? Are people going to be buying those things going forward? So now you've got to figure out, how does that demand stay, or does that kind of come back? And then how does that behave going forward? Everyone is going to be a little bit different. So really kind of understanding your business, your product families, your product groups, and then coming up with a plan, and then looking at the plan within IBP quickly to understand what the financial implications is really going to be how we think a lot of companies will have to manage out of this, right? Especially in the long term, because there's so much uncertainty, okay? I don't know, Mike or Megan, do you have any kind of thoughts around that? Any commentary to add?
No, I think we had one question, I think, that kind of points to the variability, and that's, is the XYZ and analytical capabilities in IBP, is that a useful tool, or is that not so useful when you get into these scenarios in the short term?
Yeah, I'm a big, the XYZ capabilities and looking at your trends, again, it's a tool that has a lot of capabilities and will then help you drive into a statistical forecast based on what the data is showing you. I think what you'll see in here in the next couple of months is when is it an outlier and an anomaly for 1 or 2 periods or 3 periods, and when does it become a trend? And when does that become the new normal? I think that's kind of what we were talking about before. The math is going to be based on, the XYZ, and the statistical forecast will be based on the numbers that are input. And if the numbers that are input, your sales history and all the causal factors, et cetera, if those are anomalies, then the output is going to be suspect. So yeah, there's opportunities there. And certainly this is an area where I think you want to review, but look at it a little bit more cautiously. Okay. But again, so Megan, if you want to kind of talk through, move into the demo that you have to kind of show the various scenarios. So I think that'll give us, we'll be able to get through that and kind of finish up.
Yep. So what I kind of like to say is that IBP is a big toolbox for demand planners, for supply planners, right? So you have all of these different tools that you can utilize going forward for your go forward plan, for your consensus demand plan, for your supply plan. And a big tool that IBP has is this scenario planning. And basically what I'm going to do here is show some different consensus demand plan scenarios versus the baseline. So what Pat went through originally, our original plan, and then these scenarios in which Pat also just went through from our PowerPoint, and kind of translating that into a scenario into a consensus demand plan. And what scenarios are in IBP, they're basically used by planners to perform simulations and planning on the fly. And something about the scenario is that this planning data is only available to the planner who created it, right? So you have the option to share these scenarios across multiple networks, or you can just use this scenario for your own creation purposes. And one more thing about it is that the baseline scenario is this baseline here. It's already provided. That's what you're starting with. This is your starting point. And that is the data that is active, right? That's what you're actually utilizing. These scenarios, they're for your what if purposes. They don't need to be promoted. But in this instance right now that we're going to talk through, we're going to choose a scenario and we're going to promote it to our baseline. And so what we're going to start out with is our first scenario, bounce back versus the baseline. And so as you're going to see here, our bounce back, we're going to start in April, and we're going to say that we're going to get closer to our baselines, closer to our original plan, close in October. So that's what this graph is showing also. It's showing this green is going to be your baseline, and then this is going to be your near-term demand cycle, what you think is actually going to happen. And that's not going to be enough for a planner. I want to be able to see what that forecast for that scenario is going to be looking forward. So I'm going to bring in my actuals. And I'm going to go back a few more months, about 8 months. I'm going to take that whole demand cycle. And I'm going to make an adjustment to my actuals quantity. And I'm going to say, I'm going to use this current demand plan that we are using as our scenario. And I'm going to put it into my actuals adjusted. And then I'm going to run my statistical forecast. And I want to know what that's going to look like going forward. So you have your actuals your actual sales history. And now I want to use my actuals going forward. I'm going to save this into the database. And then I'm going to run the statistical forecast. And while I run the statistical forecast, I'm going to go through the other scenarios that we have to go forward with our plan.
And one of the things that we kind of want to talk through in for those of you who aren't aware of or haven't spent a lot of time in IBP, we're looking at this at a very detailed level. When you manage when you're managing your demand plan, especially if you've got thousands of SKUs, you're going to want to manage at a much higher level, right? So product family or customer grouping, et cetera. So again, it depends on the business and the industry and how your demand planning is set up. But you want to be looking at this at a high level and then drilling down into the lower level for those exceptions. Again, we're at the detail level here, but a normal demand planning process, you would be looking at product families at a much higher level than we're showing today.
Right. Okay. So while that's running, I am going to pull up our next scenario. And in IBP, it's very flexible. You can just adjust the scenario. I can bring in all 3 scenarios versus my baseline. But for right now, we're just going to do now our midterm recovery versus our baseline. And you can change the time period. I'm going to change it to our current month just to eliminate the extra noise that we needed for the statistical forecast for the sales history. And so what we're going to see here is similar to how Pat spoke about it, right? We are significantly cutting our sales, and that is what we're going to base our consensus demand plan off of. And we're going to say that this is a midterm recovery. So we're looking at this to start recovering August, September, December. We're expecting to be back onto our plan. Another thing about this is you can look at this in revenue in dollar form, or you can look at it in this quantity. So as a demand planner, maybe you're working a lot in quantities, but when you bring this to your SNOP meeting, you want to be able to show the revenue numbers. So this is going to be our second scenario. And just for time's sake, I'm going to go into our third scenario quickly, and then I'm going to show all 3 scenarios together with that adjusted statistical forecast that we just did.
And Meagan,
for
I know
our first scenario.
I'm guilty of this just as much as anybody, but when you're working in AP a lot, it's easy to kind of blow through the fact that you can compare scenarios side by side, but if some of our attendees are using APO, this is like a game changer for them. So just to be able to do that analysis and switch back and forth with revenue and units, not only does it provide very quick visual intuitive capabilities, but it also allows you to, assess the damage in real time. Even when we're doing aggregates like Pat talked about, none of the calculations are in aggregate. They're all multiplied at the detail level and rolled up. So when you're doing revenue calculations, it's actually doing each unit by the price of that unit and aggregating all of the results, not using averages to calculate.
Yeah,
that's a big deal.
Yeah, and that's a big improvement from the APO world, where you would look at the financial implications were very difficult. In this, it's priced by customer by period, so you can have, as you've got and then currency conversions, all that kind of stuff. So head and shoulders above the capabilities that you had in present day or that you have in APO. And then the other thing we're going to kind of talk about is from relative to APO is the simulation versions can be published. So as you work offline in different planning versions, what you would do today in APO, you always had to redo it again within your baseline version. In this case, the capability exists to IBP to just promote it, right? So you go into your SNOP meeting, you take your 5 scenarios, right, that you've worked with your sales team, your marketing team, the business plan, et cetera, and then come to an agreement based on a consensus number that you all agree upon, and then you publish that to that would get the one that would be published, right? So you've got that capability to just to make those decisions in the meeting and then not redo any work, just publish it, promote it, and you're done, and then you're executing to that plan.
Right. So this is our final scenario that we're going to look at, this long-term demand loss, where we're going to see that even in December, we're not going to be back to our plan, right? So we're expecting that this is going to be a 1 to 2 year recovery before we make it back to our original plan. And I don't want to gloss over the fact that I did rerun the statistical forecast, because I think it's going to be really important to see that the changes that we have made with our first scenario, basically rerunning our stat forecast. And so I'm going to go quickly back to our original scenario, this bounce back versus the baseline. And again, I took that sales history, this 9 months for April to December, and I said, I'm going to make that my sales history for my stat forecast. And as you can see here, let me bring it up on this graph. It'll be a little easier to read. So we're going to use our baseline versus our bounce back for our stat forecasting. So this is the math, right? This is the math behind the consensus demand plan that we wanted to come up with, that we came up with as a demand planner. And so you can see that it's getting closer to where we actually want to be. And that's a really big point, because you are going to take this into your SNOP meeting and you're going to say, I think that we're going to bounce back in August, September. I need to plan my supply for that. And so what I'm going to do next is just show all 3 scenarios quickly. All 3 scenarios going forward. And then I'm going to choose a scenario to promote. So again, this graph is Excel, but it's also some EPM formatting, some formatting that's going on in the background to make it easier to do calculations like this on the fly and to compare your baseline versus your demand signals that you're thinking that you're going to get here for this scenario that we're talking through. So here we're going to choose this bounce back scenario, I think. Pat, Mike, is that good? We're going to choose bounce back to promote.
Right.
Definitely.
Okay.
Always an
So
optimist.
Stay here real quick. So what we're looking at now, and this is kind of what you would take into, these are the various scenarios. You've come to your consensus demand plan. You've looked at the math. You've got your input from the various stakeholders, and you've got 4 different scenarios that you're kind of looking at and reviewing. And this is what you would take to your S&OP plan and say, hey, this is what we think can happen. And then do we have the ability to a view to look at the financial implications too? Do we have that available already? Okay. So what we would do additionally is then we would look at the revenue numbers for this based on that product family, based on the the shipping location, whatever it may be, the customers. And then now what you can do is you can say, okay, I'm taking both of these pieces of information in, and this is my impact not only to my quantities, right? I'm able to support the plan based on the quantities, but this is my impact to my revenue and my long-term projections. So again, taking that up against your financial plan and being able to review the two and say, here's my gap, right? This is what I think based on these 3 scenarios, my small, medium, large impact, short-term, long-term, midterm. This is how it's going to impact me and my revenue, our business and our revenue, right? Okay. So go ahead, go back into the promotion.
all right. So we are now going to promote a scenario. So it's simple. We're just going to go here. We can see that this is my bounce back scenario. I shared it with Pat, and I'm going to click promote. I'm going to let everyone know this is a demo. Let's say crisis. You can leave a comment so that way someone would know why you promoted this scenario if need be. Now we're going to apply the changes. Simple as that to recreate this baseline here. And so now what you're going to see is this baseline is now equal to our bounce back scenario. So now we talked about next week that we're going to go through the S&OP supply process and how we're going to actually take this baseline and we're going to bring that to our S&OP meeting. And that came from our original scenario of our bounce back when we thought that our demand plan was going to start to kind of level out a little bit. So one more thing, I want to go back to that original page that Pat showed you, and I want to say refresh. Okay, so what you're going to see here is that now you're going to bring this into your S&OP meeting. This is the original baseline plan. Now it's adjusted, and now you have a conversation piece as a demand planner to say, here are the scenarios that I found the implications for, and here is my plan to go forward and what I've mitigated that with.
Right. Again, and this is coming out of the S&OP meeting, essentially taking this to the leadership and making a collective decision with your leadership and the stakeholders in your organization. Again, next week we'll talk about the implications of reviewing your supply plan and then getting the impacts of your supply chain disruptions. But this is just taking the independent demand. When do you think you'll be able to recover that demand signal that potentially has been broken or impacted by the coronavirus in this case, or any other business issue that comes along? Okay, I think that's it, Mike. Anything else to add in, or any questions we have? Are you on mute, Mike?
We'll give it just a minute for questions. I think what everybody hopefully can take away from this is that there are tools to help you, whether it's the outlier correction, whether it's the metrics, whether it's just visualization. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of judgment that comes in here. And that's where the actual people really matter in your demand planning process. And having a strong demand management and a strong S&OP process is probably the best backstop against outliers like this, as opposed to anything technologically driven.
Right. And that's the one thing where IBP really shines, the ability to quickly. I mean, you're using Excel for your front end, and the ability to quickly input the demand, the scenarios, right, at a high level, and quickly run through the scenarios. And Mike will show this next week with supply side, but we can take those 3 scenarios and understand, you know, do I have any supply constraints, et cetera. We'll be able to support that plan. And then start building each one of these out. So you've got a comprehensive decision, a comprehensive data to make the right decision for your business. And that's really what demand management is going to be like in the next 3 to 6 months.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I appreciate everybody logging in and spending some time with us. I know it's a crazy time and it does take some time out of your day, and we always do appreciate it. We're going to send out a recording of this webinar. It's also going to go on our YouTube channel, so check that out and subscribe for future webinars. And like we said, we have one next week, which will show up with the registration link in your inbox later today. So with that, appreciate everybody's attention, and we will see you next week. Thanks again. Oh, there we are.